Charlie Kirk's form of Christianity is a form of white supremacy by which I have a theory that in America there are two types of main Christianity. One worships Jesus, the other worships white supremacy. And the reason why I can back this up is because I did my undergraduate thesis on the color of Jesus back when I was in the Bible Belt of northern Florida. Which I had no idea what kind of racial dynamics and politics I was getting into at the time, but this will absolutely be a lecture. So if you want to buckle in and sit down for this, this is actually kind of interesting. My first point, though, I do want to make is that the KKK, and I'm talking about the revival of the KKK, like post D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation, created this revival of the KKK. And why I bring this up that is so important and necessary is because the KKK identified as Christians, and not just Christians, but they had three basic enemies, or like in their basic like manifesto. Number one, obviously, not surprisingly, black people. Number two, Jewish people. The third, though, were Catholics. And the reason for Catholics, when I was diving further into like the reasoning about why it was Catholics, was because they identified Catholics as like too European, like they were too affiliated with like Europeanness. And in this branch of white supremacy that the KKK has kind of manifested, which is a predominant ideology that obviously is found in the United States, is that being too European is not white enough, because whiteness is a separation, right? We even understand that in the history of like supremacist, fascist ideologies, right? When they were stripping buildings of like ornate color and creating these like, communist fascist buildings of the simplicity, they were essentially trying to separate Europe and create this kind of conformity. So this stripping down is this form of supremacy culture that we know that has happened in Europe, that we can also see in the United States. But taking a step further, when we talk about the color of Christ, okay? When I was reading, there was number one, the book was called Color of Christ. The second book I read was American Jesus. Both of these books were really supplemental to my research. And one of the really important things they were saying was that the American immigrants, the immigrants coming into America, who were becoming the first Americans, were in fact Protestants, and not just Protestants, but the specific brand of iconoclasts. Iconoclasts were essentially this wave of Protestantism that kind of came after like the Catholics, where they kind of started to see images of Jesus and other religious figures as idolatry. And so what they started doing was they started dismantling and destroying them. If you actually see, like, there's a lot of history, I think, in Germany, where you actually can see this form of iconoclasm where like these busts were destroyed, right? We know that it was what was his name? Saint John of Damascus, I believe, who argued that the images of Jesus were not in fact idol worship, because they were representations of what we were worshiping. We weren't worshiping the idols themselves. I believe it was John of Damascus. I have to double check on that. But when we look at these other forms of images of Jesus, right, there were essentially no images of Jesus under these Protestant circles that were manifesting in America. And I know people can say, well, what about the Catholics that were like on Spanish territory? Well, Spanish territory was not America yet. And that is also really important to me. But then, so Joseph Smith in the mid 1800s, right? This is the first idea of perhaps like images of Jesus that we might actually come to know, by which he claimed to have seen a white pillar of light. And a few years later, changed the statement to say, actually, I saw Jesus, he was blonde hair and blue eyed. And this did in fact result in Mormon Christian groups creating images of Jesus that were in fact blonde hair, blue eyed. And there was in fact an attempt in the United States to separate and segregate Jesus from his Middle Eastern or even European heritage. And it was very interesting because these images became extremely political. Indigenous people and black enslaved people were absolutely shocked when they were like, wait, this is the Jesus we were worshiping the whole time, question mark. But we also did notice really interesting, like, weird manifestations of this image of like white Jesus, by which in the time of Jewish refugees trying to flee and enter into America, there was actually really big movements of Americans who are trying to be like, well, Jesus wasn't Jewish, he was blonde hair, blue eyed, therefore we don't need to help these Jewish people who are trying to escape the, you know, the Nazi fascist regimes. So it is really interesting to look at from this particular lens, because when you look at people like Charlie Kirk and the values that they worship and how far they have absolutely separated from the actual teachings of Jesus, right? But still claim to worship Jesus. They don't worship Jesus, they worship America. And America, for them, is a symbol of the whiteness, of the separation of all these other influences to create what they know today. Wow, I did not even realize I didn't even stutter very much on this. But yeah, it's crazy, honestly.